How old are your athletes is the lesson I'm going to be covering next. So it's an interesting question when you ask how old are your athletes, because there's a lot of different things that can actually take shape of when you're defining their age. We have training age, biological age, and chronological age. And all of them are not the same at all. You may have an athlete that is maybe 53 chronologically, but at training they're 1. And biologically, especially when we're talking about middle schoolers and high schoolers, even college, just because their chronological age is the same does not mean their biological age is the same too. So let's break this down a little bit more, because it's important when we're getting very specific in our dryland training to be able to identify the differences in these different types of ages when you're defining it. So with training age, that's defined as how long the athlete has consistently been in a resistance training program. So for master swimmers, it may be a little bit interesting to figure out that age because maybe they trained consistently for a few years when they were in college or high school, and then they took a break and then they came back. So that may be a little bit more work to put together what that age is. But for younger kids, that's probably going to be pretty easy. Have they started strength training or not? So that's training age specifically. How long have you been doing a structured resistance training program? Now, biological age is the stages of maturation or development, such as skeletal age and physical maturity. So basically, has the athlete hit puberty, and where are they in that spectrum of developing? Again, this is going to be very specific more towards your middle schoolers, maybe even elementary, high school, and college, because again, swimmers may be the same age, but very different in terms of have they hit puberty yet and where are they at in their stages of development. And lastly, chronological age. That's pretty simple. The athlete's age in months and years. So just understand that off the bat, these 3 ages, the training, biological, and chronological age, are probably going to never line up. And so you need to understand how to figure out which one, or at least be in the ballpark, right? You need to know, hey, is this athlete pretty well developed through puberty, or have they not even started yet? Has this athlete done a couple years of strength training or not? Is this athlete 21 or not? Things like that, you need to make sure you're able to just be able to identify and then get to work in making the program specific. So ask yourself, when you're asking what age are they, which ones are you looking at? The biggest mistake a lot of coaches will fall into is just because an athlete has a higher chronological age does not mean they have a higher ability. We have trained some master swimmers, 50s, 60s, that are really well accomplished, but honestly, their program, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference that much between a high schooler's and theirs sometimes. So just because their age is very different doesn't necessarily mean their ability is very different. So make sure you're not falling into that trap of thinking, okay, this athlete is in college, so they have to have a lot more ability than a high schooler or middle schooler. Well, that's not necessarily the case. You need to look at all 3 of those ages, and then also the assessments, the tests, to make sure that you have the full picture of what their ability really is. And so everybody's going to be developing differently at different rates. What we need to understand with those ages specifically is to know how it ties into some of these adaptations. Because obviously everyone has motor units and they're firing their muscles. But based on ages, or whether that be training ages, biological, or even chronological ages, the rate of adaptations, or even the adaptation itself, may be a little bit different. So for a 6 and 7-year-old, that's when you want to make sure you're really exposing the neuromuscular system to as many types of movements, possibilities as possible, because there's a window of development that's really prime for motor units to have coordination, to be able to fire and produce a tetanus to fire the muscle. And so that's really important to know when you're working with younger kids. Whereas if you have a master swimmer in their 50s and 60s and they haven't had a lot of those experiences, know that it's going to be probably a little bit difficult, and it's going to be slow going in terms of their rate of improvement. Not saying it's impossible, but just understanding, hey, they didn't have necessarily a lot of background athletically as a younger kid. And so in some ways, they're going to be hampered a little bit. So just being able to understand that and put together the full picture. Of course, everybody has muscles that can work through all types of contractions, concentric, eccentric, isometric. But again, if they're not exposed to a lot of different types of movements, rhythms, coordinations, the muscle contractions when they're younger, it's going to be harder to teach that later on. because we know that the nervous system is what enables then energy and energy into movement. And so knowing what your athletes were as much younger athletes, that's going to be important, especially with the older athletes that you're dealing with. Knowing their background is going to be really helpful as you're putting together their program. Even something like the general adaptation syndrome. The younger they are, probably the quicker they're going to be able to move through some of these. But then also when you get older, you could get really quick into exhaustion stage. So just being able to understand, okay, we understand the general adaptation syndrome, but now how does it specifically fit with the population that you're working with and trying to create the best program for them? So just being aware of that. And even the principle of progressive overload that we've talked about before. Knowing that if the athlete has a large background of strength training, so if their training age is very old, it's going to be harder to continually progressively overload. You're going to have to work a lot more. Whereas if they have a training age of 0, almost anything is going to have improvement for them. So don't trick yourself into thinking you have the best program because you have an athlete that has 0 to 1 training age and you've put something together and they've just exceeded your expectations because they've improved so much. Well, they were probably going to improve at anything. So just understanding where something like the principle of progressive overload fits in whatever specific population you're working with is going to be helpful for you as you're putting your program together. So don't just fall into the trap of saying, how old are you? And that answers all your questions. You need to know the training age, biological age, and chronological age. And that's going to then dictate the rate and type of adaptations in some of the principles that we've talked about. We're going to dive into more of this in the coming lesson.